Today I'm going to teach you how to make your own mouse pad using fabric and batting. First, you need to trace the shape onto the fabric. I decided to do a circle, so I'm using a bowl to create my shape, and I traced it with Taylor's chalk. It's a waxy chalk I like to use, and I traced 2 circles onto my fabric. You can do any shape you want as long as there's space for the mouse when you use it. Then I cut it out with my fabric scissors, and when I drew my circles, I decided to, since this print is the repeat is so large, I decided to line them up right next to each other so I would have the exact same colors and stripes, because I wanted specific colors for my mouse pad instead of just putting them next to each other and having a bunch of different colors. It really depends on the repeat of your fabric. If you have a small repeat, then you can place your shape wherever you want. So choose what you want depending on your fabric. Then I like to use my circles I've already cut out to trace my batting. I just feel like it's easier instead of tracing onto batting because it's white. So it's really important that you cut out 2 pieces of batting. I found that if you use only 1 layer of batting, it's not quite heavy enough to hold up against the weight of pushing the mouse around. So I found that 2 layers of batting was the perfect weight so that the mouse pad would not move when you're using the mouse on top of it. Next, put your fabric right sides together, and then I like to put both of my batting on one side on the back of my fabric because I do not like to sew with batting on the top. So I put both of mine on the back. If sewing on batting doesn't bother you, then you can put batting on both sides, and it's a little easier when you sew the hole closed at the end. But you should do what you like best instead of making it harder for yourself. So pin all the way around the edges so that you can sew it together. Next, you're going to sew your mouse pad together. So I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch, and I'm using a regular stitch length with a universal needle that's size 1280, and I'm just sewing all the way around the mouse pad. The batting is on the bottom, the 2 layers with the fabric. The wrong side of the fabric is face up. And make sure when you get to the end to leave a 3-inch hole. I'll show you mine in just a second. There's my 3-inch hole so that I can turn it right side. After you sew the mouse pad together, you're going to take your regular fabric scissors and you're going to cut the batting down to 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. You want the seam allowance to be really tiny so it doesn't create any bulk for your mouse pad on the edges. And since I'm cutting 2 layers of batting at the same time, it's a little tricky to get in there without cutting the other seam allowance. So you can see I struggle a little bit, but it's really important to cut that batting away so you have less bulk. Then I'm taking a pair of pinking shears, and since it's a circle, you need to reduce the bulk when it turns right side out. So I'm using pinking shears, and I'm going all the way around, and I'm cutting the fabric with the pinking shears so it just reduces all the seam allowance to a smaller amount. And I even get the part that wasn't. If you're using a shape that isn't a circle, you need to still reduce the batting to 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then if you saw at the very beginning of this clip, I clipped in the inward point of the top of the heart. So if there's any inward curves or points, you need to clip right down to the seam allowance. And then on the outer curves, that's where you use pinking shears to reduce the bulk for those curves. So depending on the shape you use, if you have a triangle, then you have to clip or trim the corners. If you have inward curves like the top of a heart, you have to clip the point. So there I'm reducing the bulk at the point, and I trimmed that, and now I'm doing the pinking shears just around the curves. So take note when you're doing a different shape that you might have different trimming to do on the seam allowance. Next, you turn your mouse pad right side out, and you make sure that you're turning it right side out where the right side of the fabric is instead of between the fabric and the batting. So pull it all right side out, and then I use my fingers and I push it into those seams to make sure that the curve really comes out and the seam allowance is really pushed up into that seam, because I want a beautiful round circle instead of a lopsided circle. So I'm rolling those seams out. Then you're going to pin the hole closed by folding the seam allowance in and on both sides and then pinning it closed. It's a little tricky with 2 layers of batting to pin it because it's so thick and bulky, but it's really important that you get this side pinned in and the curve really nice so that it looks like a circle. So I pinned the very middle of the hole with a pin, and then I'm carefully folding in the other pieces, the other parts of the open hole, the seam allowance. You have to make sure you fold it in so that there's no raw edges, and you don't want that fabric to fray if it's exposed, the raw edges of the fabric. And when you pin, you want to go in at an angle instead of straight down and then pulling, because you'll pull your fabric a little bit and it will be a little warped when you go to use it with your mouse. Now I'm going to edge stitch the hole closed. So I'm sewing at a 1/8 seam allowance right on the edge of the fabric, and I'm going over that hole first. So I make sure to close all of that, and I pull out my pins before I go over it. So I'm sewing carefully around, and now that I finished the hole, I'm just going around the rest of the mouse pad to make the edges lie flat and the seams lie flat. It just makes it look nice and professional and finished. So I'm going to finish going all the way around the circle until I get back to the beginning where I closed the hole. The last and most important step of sewing is to press what you worked on so that it is finished and it looks nice and clean and ironed. So I'm showing you the heart one that I showed you how to cut out. I made it the same way as the circle one, so I pressed it really well, and now I am pressing this circle one, and I have a small ironing board here, so I have to do each half separately, but I did both the front and the back in each half, so I got it really pressed, and I used steam and heat. This is cotton fabric, so I used a cotton setting because I wanted it to be nice and flat. And now your mouse pad is finished and you can use it. Thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for lots of sewing tips, tutorials, and tricks.